Berlin, March 31st, 1935. Spartacus Olsen reporting from the German capital. The first quarter of 1935 brought a seismic shift to Europe. Hitler has come clean about his militaristic ambitions and torn down the blocking wall set up in 1919 to stop a resurgence of German aggression. His domestic popularity grew yet again as he stepped out of the shadows of the Versailles Treaty and into the basking light of the return of the Saarland to the Reich. Tonight, we look back at a quarter when Germany felt like Hitler delivered on his promise to restore the nation's military might and pride, while behind the curtain of propaganda, the Nazi terror continued to tighten its grip on the country. Globally, the opening of 1935 was still very much about the continuing struggles brought by the Great Depression. But in the Western world, the quarter was also much defined by Germany's brazen resurgence on the international stage, with Hitler tearing up the post-Great War order. While that stunned the international community, the responses from Britain and France were tepid, culminating in a visit by two British ministers to Berlin that only highlighted their impotence. The quarter's events began on January 13 when the Saar Plebiscite took place under international supervision. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the coal-rich Saar Basin had been detached from Germany after the World War and placed under League of Nations administration for 50 years, while France received ownership of its coal mines as compensation for the destruction of French mines during the war and as part of payment of reparations. Now, at the end of that period, the inhabitants were to decide the territory's future status by plebiscite, continued League administration, union with France, or return to Germany. When the result came in, our colleague at the Universal News Services here in Berlin, Bill Scheirer, noted, "The good Catholics and workers of the Saar voted themselves back into the Reich yesterday. Some 90% voted for reunion, more than we had expected, though no doubt many were afraid that they would be found out and punished unless they cast their ballot for Hitler. Well, at least one cause of European tension disappears." The result was a staggering victory for the Nazi regime. This diplomatic triumph set the stage for a much more aggressive move in March. On March 10th, Hermann Göring officially revealed the existence of the German Air Force to the foreign press, a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. 6 days later, March 16th, Hitler struck again. He promulgated a new law that effectively made rearmament official and eliminated parts of the Treaty of Versailles. The foreign correspondents here in Berlin were treated to a dramatic scene by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels at his Berlin ministry. Again, I quote our friend Mr. Scheirer. Finally, Goebbels limped in, looking very important and grave. He began immediately to read in a loud voice the text of a new law. He read too fast to take it down in longhand, but there was no need for that. Hitler had, of his own accord, wiped out the military sections of the Versailles Treaty, restored universal military service, and proclaimed the formation of a conscript army of 12 army corps or 36 divisions. To justify this to the world, Hitler issued a lengthy proclamation citing the failure of other nations to disarm and blaming communist chaos for global insecurity. The German people responded with jubilation, cheering Hitler wildly from the streets below the Chancellery. In late March, British Foreign Secretary Sir John Simon and Lord Privy Seal Anthony Eden visited Berlin to confer with Hitler. But the meeting resulted in pretty much nothing, with the British ministers walking away with Simon expressing that Hitler was not negotiating but simply declaring what Germany wanted. As these events unfolded, it looked like the regime had possibly temporarily paced its highest-level legislative attacks on minorities to avoid alienating the international community ahead of the plebiscite and rearmament announcements. However, out of the international spotlight, the Gestapo rapidly expanded its extrajudicial terror and systematically eroded any remaining civil rights. In yet another quarter, the Gestapo increasingly bypassed courts to impose its own decrees. It's now rumored that any returning Jewish emigres will be immediately interned in re-education camps, a euphemism for concentration camps. In February, they banned all events seeking support for Jews to remain in Germany, and in Frankfurt, Jews were explicitly forbidden from flying the swastika flag, as it is one of Germany's official flags and reserved for Aryans only. This apparatus of terror was being normalized, and the rule of law was being willingly discarded, also for non-Jewish Germans. In late February, Professor Victor Klemperer in Dresden spoke with two of his former students, who were otherwise considered anti-Nazi, about the recent trial and execution of two young aristocratic women in Berlin. Renate von Natzma, employed at the Reichswehr Ministry, and her friend Baroness Benita von Falkenhayn were accused of leaking military secrets relevant to Germany's plans and preparations vis-à-vis Poland, including the top-secret deployment plans for a potential attack. They were arrested in the spring of 1934. After nearly a year in custody when they were denied several of their basic legal rights, they were tried before the People's Court on February 16th and beheaded by axe at Plötzensee prison on February 18th. Nazi press coverage treated the executions as justified, sensational, and unprecedented, especially emphasizing that both were noblewomen. Now, in discussion about the case with Klemperer, the two relatively liberal students found the state's verdict totally appropriate and were untroubled that the accused had been denied basic legal rights. A despairing Klemperer noted that the sense of justice is being lost everywhere in Germany, is being systematically destroyed. Minorities continued to be marginalized in the cultural sphere as well. When the world-renowned Jewish painter Max Liebermann, one of the leading proponents of Impressionism in Germany and continental Europe, died in February, the Nazi press did not cover his death, reflecting the Nazis' aim to purge and discredit any art they deemed racially or culturally unacceptable. But this was not the only victory of Goebbels' growing media empire this quarter. It played a significant part in the Saar Plebiscite using radio. As part of their seizure of media in 1933, the regime took control of the German public radio network, transforming it into a centralized propaganda tool. To ensure maximum reach, Goebbels and the head of the Nazi Labor Front, Robert Ley, began using state subsidies to mass-produce the Volksempfänger, People's Receiver, a cheap radio with a limited range designed to put a propaganda loudspeaker in every household, while also making it more difficult to access foreign broadcast. Adoption was rapid. 1.5 million sets were sold in 1933 and 1934, and the number of registered listeners grew from 4.5 million in 33 to 5.4 million in 34. Now, before the Nazi power grab, public radio had a broadly pro-Weimar, anti-extremist, that is to say anti-communist and anti-Nazi slant, and unlike the democratic parties, the Nazis were denied regular airtime. In areas with good coverage, the party failed to grow the same way they did in areas where access to radio was spotty or non-existent. Experts estimated that the persuasion rate from anti-extremism radio content in 1930 was 36.8%. When Hitler was named chancellor, Goebbels immediately seized on this novel propaganda tool for the opposite purpose. Already in February 1933, the party was broadcasting daily propaganda formats. The potential to influence the public was on full display in the run-up to the Saar Plebiscite this past January. Goebbels distributed cheap radios throughout the region and organized community listening events to broadcast highly charged, emotional, nationalistic appeals. The resulting 90.7% vote for reunification further convinced the Nazi leaders of the value of radio propaganda. In February, radio also became a potential financial engine for the propaganda ministry. German households with a radio pay a license fee, and in a new agreement with the Postal Ministry, 55% of all radio licensing fees will go directly to the propaganda ministry. Moreover, once the total number of listeners surpasses 7 million, any additional fee revenue will be split between the propaganda and postal ministries at a ratio of 3-1. Money that Goebbels is eager to take, as it is rumored that his aggressive growth of control over German media and culture has been running into increasing financial trouble. That was not the only monetary turmoil for the Nazis. The German economy in the first quarter of 1935 was even more geared toward military expansion than in previous quarters. Minister of Economics Hjalmar Schacht continued to battle a mounting foreign exchange strain, growing raw material bottlenecks with increasing reliance on off-budget armaments finance such as the Mefo-Bills. While this military investment artificially reduced unemployment, creating the illusion of a booming economy for the average German worker, the structural reality was precarious. The shift from civil public works to military production was definitive. The battle for work was now increasingly a battle for arms. Despite these underlying weaknesses, the average citizen felt the benefits of a paycheck, solidifying their support for the government. The mood within the NSDAP leadership was euphoric and triumphant. Hitler's successful gambles, the overwhelming victory in the Saar Plebiscite, and the unchallenged tearing up of the Versailles Treaty cemented his absolute authority and validated his aggressive foreign policy strategies. The military leadership was delighted with the return of conscription and the public rebirth of the armed forces. Goebbels, reflecting on his speech at the celebration of reincorporation of the Saarland into the Reich on March 2nd, summarized the Nazi euphoria as he swooned about how he began to speak freely from the heart. Wonderful. The whole Reich is listening. The people in the square below are in a frenzy, like a delirium. The Heil sound like a prayer. A province reconquered. Drive through the shimmering city. Everyone is screaming and raging. Descriptions of a sentiment in the country that grew even stronger with the military developments and did not escape the community of international correspondents. On March 17th, Scheirer wrote, "Today's creation of a conscript army in open defiance of Versailles will greatly enhance his domestic position, for there are few Germans, regardless of how much they hate the Nazis, who will not support it wholeheartedly." General Werner von Blomberg, the Reich Minister of Defense, captured the elation within the Reichswehr regarding the cancellation of the Versailles military restrictions. Speaking at the Berlin Opera House on Heroes Memorial Day, he declared, "The world has been made to realize that Germany did not die of its defeat in the World War. Germany will again take the place she deserves among the nations. We pledge ourselves to a Germany which will never surrender and never again sign a treaty which cannot be fulfilled." A sentiment shared by many civilian Germans, like anatomist Hermann Voss from Mecklenburg, who had praised the Reich's withdrawal from the League of Nations in 1933 as a true deliverance and now celebrated the reintroduction of military service as excellent news. Hertha Natov, our Jewish physician in Berlin, accurately observed how these nationalistic and economic maneuvers successfully pacified the masses and forced conformity. She noted that universal conscription is introduced. Now he has won the game. I know my uniform-loving people. Now he takes the unemployed off the street, the dissatisfied, the grumbling. He puts them in uniform, makes them stand at attention, and shut their mouths. Viktor Klemperer shared his recognition of the public's conformity, writing in despair regarding the overwhelming popular approval of the regime's actions. "Today the man seems ineradicable again, and the dirty slavery completely accords with Germany and really suits 90% of all Germans." An undercover agent for the Zapata, the underground resistance network of the exiled Social Democratic Party, shared with this reporter a despairing dispatch from Munich that highlighted the sheer difficulty of resisting a regime with such widespread momentum. "Enthusiasm on 17th of March, enormous. The whole of Munich was on its feet. People can be forced to sing, but they can't be forced to sing with such enthusiasm. I experienced the days of 1914 and can only say that the declaration of war did not make the same impact on me as the reception of Hitler on 17th of March. Trust in Hitler's political talent and honest intentions is getting ever greater. He is loved by many." The first quarter of 1935 will go down in history as a critical turning point in the history of Europe. Hitler's decision to publicly repudiate the military clauses of the Versailles Treaty was a calculated and massive gamble that paid off entirely. By utilizing the legitimate return of the Saarland as a springboard for national enthusiasm, he created an atmosphere where the revolution of the Luftwaffe and the reintroduction of conscription seemed like natural, justified steps towards national sovereignty rather than aggressive preparations for war. The sheer lack of a unified, forceful response from Britain and France demonstrated to Hitler that the international community might not stand up to him, a sentiment cemented by the visits by Simon and Eden to Berlin that only proved that the Western powers were willing to negotiate with the treaty breaker, effectively legitimizing his actions. Domestically, the events bound the German people even closer to the Führer. The restoration of military pride appealed deeply to the German psyche across almost all political lines. This consensus has now made organized resistance yet more difficult. The regime has successfully masked its long-term destructive goals under a thin but opaque veneer of correcting historical injustices and restoring German dignity. The totalitarian grip has tightened, not through sheer terror alone, but through the intoxicating success of these foreign policy triumphs, which blinded many more Germans to the loss of their individual liberties and the sinister reality of the regime's expansionist agenda. As March 1935 draws to a close, Adolf Hitler has successfully crossed his first major international Rubicon. Germany is openly arming. Essential parts of the Versailles Treaty are effectively dead, and the international community has shown it lacks the resolve to stop him. Yet more of the German people, intoxicated by the illusion of restored national honor and economic recovery, have submitted to the dictatorship, leaving minorities and dissidents increasingly isolated. The foundation for a militarized, expansionist state is now fully publicly laid. The howls of the Nazi wolves are no longer the lonely tunes of the Austrian corporal and his entourage. They have grown to a chorus of voices from within the German folk, celebrating the return of its militarist past, a haunting warning that the rest of the world has chosen not to hear. Never forget. If you feel the same as me, that it is important to remember the past in this way, join the Time Ghost Army. Your participation is the only way we can keep on fighting the good fight for history and help us better understand the world around us to together forge a better future.